Well, good evening. Good to see everyone in the house of the Lord again tonight. What a powerful time of prayer we just had, and thank you for being faithful in attending. And whether you prayed here or at home, we just thank you for your faithfulness and watching or attending service tonight. Um, Tonight we will continue our Bible engagement lesson. And of course, last week was Israel had went to Samuel and said, "Hey, we know you're getting a little up there in age, and we want a king, like all the other nations that surround us. We want someone to rule over us." And Samuel sought the Lord, and the Lord told him, said, "Well, yeah, they're not just rejecting you, they're rejecting me." But he said, I'm going to let them have a king, but warn them that this is the way it's going to go. And even after Samuel's warning, they said, "So be it. It'll be on us." And and we find that they did anoint Saul as king, and we know that things went just exactly how the Lord had spoke it and how Samuel had warned them. Saul's reign was for the most part, disastrous. Finally he failed. He failed and took matters into his own hands, and the Lord sent Samuel to tell him that his kingdom would end. It would not go on. His lineage as king would not pass down to Jonathan and so forth and so forth, and actually that he was going to give his king to another, and actually he had already selected that person, and that person would be a man described as after God's own heart. So that's where we are tonight, that we're going to look at the David and Goliath, but it's not so much, we know that story of David slaying Goliath, but it's not going to be so much that in particular, but it's going to be the preparation that went into that, as God also prepares us to slay whatever giants may be in our life or we may run across. We know that Samuel anointed David as the next leader of God's people. And I'm sure as a young boy, he went to the house of Jesse, and he looked at his oldest, and Samuel, in his own natural eyes, thought, "This must be the guy. Man, he's tall, he's great looking, he's got it sort of all together." And God said, "No, that's not him. I'm looking for someone after my own heart that will listen to me and follow me and loves me." And I look at the heart, and you're looking on the outside, and he goes to the second, and so on. And finally, he gets to the last that Jesse has shown him and produced there in front of Samuel, and God says, "No, it's not him either." And he asked him, is there any other? And they said, "Well, we got some scrawny kid out watching the sheep. Surely it's not him. He's just a boy." But Samuel says, "We're not going to rest or sit until you go get him." So they brought, and God said, "Yes, he's the one." And I'm sure maybe as David is being anointed there before his father and brothers, sort of similar to Joseph's story in a little bit, shading that, I'm sure that maybe David even thought, "Oh boy, no more sheep. No more out to myself." But that we find that wasn't the case, was it? After the anointing, he went back to looking after sheep. And if we take notice, none of our biblical heroes started out leading a nation or defeating their arch enemy in battle. We take Joseph, as we mentioned, for example. God showed him and gave him the dream of the moon and the stars and bowing down, and he was just a young lad as David was. But he didn't go from his dream one night to his purpose the very next day, or living in his purpose, or that transpiring. A lot of preparation time went into from that moment until he was the second in command of all of Egypt. And we look at Moses, 40 years in the desert, on the backside of the desert, before he had his burning bush moment, and God fully laid out the plan for that he had for Moses, from saving him from being drowned in the Nile, from saving from the crocodiles that swam there, to being raised in the house of Pharaoh, being exiled, then running for his life to be brought back to lead a nation out of bondage. We find that Gideon hiding in a wine press, trying to beat out a little bit of grain or barley for his family so they could have something to eat, and called by the angel, called a mighty man of valor. But yet before that, there was preparation time of purpose in his life. And even after seeing an angel, I would think that would have been pretty convincing. But yet he put a fleece before the Lord and said, "Are you sure? Are you sure that I'm the guy? Are you sure this is what I'm supposed to do?" And then David also was not exempt of going through the things that I want to call preparation for purpose, to lead or to fight their giants, or even both. All of these and many more. And so today, so it is with us in our lives, in our Christ walk, as we follow Jesus and go after God, that each of us, whether we want to think so or not, or believe so or not, we each have an intricate purpose in our life. That God, when we surrendered our life and laid our life down and took the grace that covered a multitude of sin in our lives, and said, "Yeah, I'm going to follow Jesus. I'm going to live, and I'm going to lay my life down, and I want the life that you have for me and the purpose that you have for me, Lord." He began preparing in each of us for the future, building us our spiritual strength, which relates into our spiritual faith. Our faith is built through the trials that we face, the circumstances that they face, whether they've been great or small. Building our faith, building our belief to overcome and defeat, and not only overcome and defeat, but to kill the giants in our life that have come into our territory and stand and shout. I find it very interesting in looking at the word here, that this was one of the first times the Israelites and the Philistines had been warring for quite some time, decades. But this was one of the time. Most of those were border wars, going back and forth right along the border. But this was one of the first times that the Philistines had actually gathered an army great enough that they had invaded Israel. And so they were there standing in Israel's territory, Goliath was. And he came out, the word tells us, for 40 days. Morning and evening, he would come out and challenge and shout at them and curse at them and tell them all that he was going to do to them. And Saul, the word we'll read a little bit, that Saul and all of Israel, they were terrified. So, but now spiritually in our lives, that those giants, that they come into our territory, and that they stand shouting at us. These giants, a lot of times, they have names just like Goliath had one. But their names are bitterness. Their names are hurt, guilt, regret, doubt, finances, addiction, health. And they can even have flesh and blood, like loved ones and co-workers, neighbors, folks you run into that you thought, "Man, where'd this dude come from? And why are they yelling at me?" And giants in all forms. And there again, like I said, they're not just spiritual, but they can be flesh and blood too. And but God doesn't leave us hanging. He's preparing us. Even there are times that we may say, what in the world is going on? He's still preparing us and building our faith and keeping us going, knowing that once showing us a way to overcome, only to face maybe something a little stronger, something maybe a little bit more trying, a little bit more frustrating. And it's so easy to get frustrated. And before we watch the video, I'll just share this with you. As you guys know, I've been wearing this crazy box for about 8 months. But I have an appointment, a procedure scheduled in the 14th of September to do the pacemaker type thing. Well, only Tam came home last night. And she said, I don't want to, upset you, but I have heard through sources that Ballad Health, where they're going to do the procedure, has taken elective surgeries off the board for a while because of the recent, upswing of COVID-19 or the variant. So they're going to take that off. Said it may or may not happen. I just want you, be prepared. And I said, well, okay, whether it does or whether it don't. But it was a moment that could have turned the other way. And then on Sunday, as you know, some of you know, this crazy thing was going off and not doing it. It wasn't anything that was associated with my heart. It was just like breaking connection, and the belt was loose and all kinds of just aggravating things. And I'd been a little frustrated with that. Well, with all that could have been, one of those moments that you thought, man, not again, and this, that, and the other. But this morning, I got a call from Kingsport, and it was the nurse there, and she said, with all the things going on, I thought, yeah, I know you're not going to do this procedure. She said, no, you just need a negative COVID test 7 to 5 days. And I said, well, are you still doing this? She said, oh, yeah, you're still on the schedule, and this is on a different tier, and everything's good. You just need to do this and have it faxed to us. Here's the fax number. And I thought, wow, I could have gotten uptight, could have got sideways, could have said whatever or thought whatever, and it wouldn't have done any good. But here, what difference 24 hours make? Well, to top that, I got here to the church, and Pastor and I were talking. I get a phone call, and it's Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We've all gotten them. I thought, this is going to be about my car warranty. Either that or Pastor has committed some type of fraud somewhere. He got that call right before I got the one from Pittsburgh. It was hilarious. I won't go into details. They hung up on him for a change. He done it in a godly fashion, I promise. But I answered it, and I thought, I'm going to have some fun here too. He's not the only one that's going to, And it was the folks from Zoll, and they said, we were looking at the download last night, and we noticed you have a faulty vest, and we're sending you 2 new ones overnight. So, it was just, doesn't God work it out? And we can get frustrated, we can get tore up, and, I could have called them and said, this crazy thing, I'm getting ready to throw it out in the road, which is actually what I thought. But God worked it out. And I don't mean, that was them looking at it, downloading things. But he said, what I mean when I say work it out, it was, you've been through worse than this. You've overcome this, and you don't let this affect your day, and don't let this affect how you speak to others, whomever you may meet, whether it's in a foul mood and at the grocery store and they step in front of you, or there again, my favorite saying, they got 60 items in a 12-item checkout. And the reason you know that is because you've counted them, and I do that. So let's watch the video.
Do you remember that U.S. Airways pilot who made an emergency landing on the Hudson River? They called it the Miracle on the Hudson. After hitting a flock of geese, the plane lost both of its engines, and the pilot was forced to glide the plane down onto the surface of the river. And not a single person was lost. The media and all the experts praised the pilot's abilities to execute such a challenging maneuver. What wasn't always reported is that the pilot, in addition to being a former fighter pilot and an expert in aviation safety, was also a certified glider pilot. It may very well have been that hobby which prepared him for that fateful moment over the Hudson. But I imagine he probably never thought that all those days training in a glider would one day save his life and hundreds more. Who would have thought that it was all a long preparation for one of his life's biggest moments? Most people are familiar with the story of David and Goliath. The image of Goliath is fixed in our cultural imagination. A giant towering over his opponents, beating his sword against his shield as he mocked the terrified Israelites hiding behind rocks. Before the legendary Goliath, no one felt prepared to challenge him. It's to our surprise, as much as theirs, that David was the lone figure willing to take on the challenge. David wasn't a soldier, nor did he have any training or experience on the battlefield. He was a shepherd, a marginalized and overlooked position of necessity, not honor. But David was somehow confident when others were not. "Don't worry about this Philistine," David told Saul. "I'll go fight him." "Don't be ridiculous," Saul replied. "There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy, and he's been a man of war since his youth." But David persisted. "I've been taking care of my father's sheep and goats." That's not exactly a resume for battlefield success. Desperate for anyone to fight, King Saul accepted, but insisted that David wear his royal armor. Saul reacts like we usually do. If you're going to take on something you're seemingly unprepared for, you better at least look the part. David wasn't a soldier, though maybe he could at least look like one. But David refused. David put it on, strapped the sword over it, and took a step or two to see what it was like, for he had never worn such things before. "I can't go in these," he protested to Saul. "I'm not used to them." So David took them off again. He picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them into his shepherd's bag. Then, armed only with his shepherd's staff and sling, started across the valley to fight the Philistine. David refused to face Goliath as anything other than what he was. There was no pretending, no pretense, no artificial swagger. He was only what he already knew. David explained, "When a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. I have done this to both lions and bears, and I'll do it to this pagan Philistine too." What David realized was that his overlooked time as a shepherd, guarding helpless sheep, was actually a critical part of his preparation for just this moment. God had prepared him against lions and bears to now stand with confidence against Goliath. While David's brothers had been off attempting to earn their reputation and honor on the battlefield, David had been content with the work before him, sheep. How many nights had he slept alone in that wilderness, surrounded by only the stars and his sheep? There was no battlefield glory in being alone. Yet it wasn't wasted time. It had been a long preparation, preparing not only his skills for defense, but also his trust and faith in God. Suddenly flooded by those pastoral memories, the feel of the sling in his hand, the weight of those 5 smooth stones in his bag, The mighty Goliath suddenly appeared smaller, like one of those bears standing on his back two legs, his curses and wagging head like the lion's roar and tossing mane. What was one more bear, one more lion? David was prepared for just this moment. Or as David put it, the Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine. Do you think David, years before, sitting alone in some quiet pasture watching those helpless sheep chew grass and pick at bushes, bored by the routine of it all, do you think he could have ever realized how much that preparation would one day matter? Probably not, but God knew and was preparing him even as he daydreamed in far more adventurous places. There are preparations happening which you can't fully recognize. There are lessons you're learning which you couldn't have planned. Your boredom and the restlessness you feel is not the final meaning of this moment. David reminds us that we all have a shepherd who's guiding and leading us. By his lead, every day is preparation for those days waiting just ahead of us.
God's preparation gave David the testimony of the lion and the bear. God's preparation of while he was tending sheep, the struggle of keeping the sheep safe gave David the courage that, you know what? A lion and a bear may be able to could kill you or even eat you for that matter. What's this giant? What's this giant that has come and what is he to what I have already went through? That what God has already brought me through would be better to say or to put out. See, every day in our lives as Christ followers, every day is a preparation day, whether we know it or not. Where we, even as bored as it may be, or you say I've not done, or had no moment to witness to someone or take someone down the Damascus road or have one of those God moments. But even in that day, on how we even handle the little inconveniences and the little frustrations, and that's why, I pointed out about the box, how we handle those, our preparation. Do we lose our temper? Do we, think things we ought not? Let our minds go to places that they shouldn't be? Every one of those is preparation for those moments, whether it be a giant or a frustration in our life or a circumstance that God is also builds our faith that we can overcome, that He was with us in that moment, that He saved us from the jaw of the lion and the claw of the bear, to be able to not only know in our life that we can make it through the next challenge or the next hurdle, no matter what that may be, but also to give encouragement to others that we can say, hey, you know what? I have been where you're at. It's very hard. I noticed this when I went through some of my cancer treatment. I'm going to touch a little bit on that tonight and some things as the giant in my life. I was thinking about this lesson in this study. It's really been my health. Oh, even though it's been a time span in between, it has been. But getting back to that, it's hard to say someone. In my case, it was cancer, and the first time around, and it's hard to look at someone that with the same diagnosis or the same prognosis and say and not been there and say, I know how you feel. It's impossible. But if you've been there, and once, someone that don't know your story and you only know a little bit of theirs, and you say, hey, I've been there. This was my situation. And man, their ears perk up, and they're interested. And sort of akin to when you've ever seen veterans of the military service get together, no matter what branch, and one recognizes or knows or mentions that they were a veteran, and what outfit, what did you do, what branch, what era of service time did you serve, and there's a kinship that no matter where or when, or whether it was World War II or Korea or Vietnam or Desert Storm or Enduring Freedom, they know one another, and they can relate to one another. And that's how it should be as even Christ followers, as Christians, that when a brother or sister is going through, and no one else may even know your past experience or when or how long ago that was, that you can also give encouragement that, hey, I faced that giant also. And you know what? I was able to, through faith, to not only to overcome, not only to defeat, but I got to cut its head off and overcome. See, every day is a preparation. Every day can be that line or bare moment, but it prepares us moments for faith to rise up against these. Our giants may not be 9'9" as Goliath was, but they can look, whether spiritually or real, just as daunting, just as big. And they may come and shout at us for 40 days and shake their fists. But know this, that God, you're in preparation, and God has equipped you just as David was equipped. He couldn't fight with Saul's armor. He had never been trained with Saul's armor. And if he had waddled out as a young boy, loaded down with armor on that battlefield, no doubt, without a miracle, he would have been slain. But yet he took what God had prepared him with and what God had used and given him to use, a sling and a stone and a shepherd's staff. And he defeated what a whole army and king were afraid of that day, literally. And what we can do with that, I know that it's our purpose. And just as Saul's armor, it can't be borrowed. We can't borrow someone else's purpose. We can't borrow someone else's life. Each of ours is our own to ourselves. But there again, that doesn't mean we keep it to ourselves. We give encouragement to others. You know, for in verses 30, I'm not going to read that. He read it. For me, there again, I said my giant was my health. And what I tell you tonight, please, I'm telling you for God's glory, because it wasn't anything that I did. And it wasn't, I had great care, but even they were baffled at the end. I had those moments of when to go into a doctor's office and say, where's your wife? You need to call her. No, what's going on? No, where's your wife? No, what's going on? You know. And finally, they put the X-ray on the viewer, and you know that you know. You know that you know. And then to go and instantly the enemy of your soul say, you know, you're 36 years old. You got a 15-year-old son. You're never going to see him graduate. You're never going to see him get through college. You're never going to see him married. You're never going to see any grandkids. You're not going to. We're still waiting on that one. If you're watching, Brian. You got to do what you got to do. But you know that you're going to leave a widow. What are they going to do? You know, you can't. You know, all those things that giant called cancer stood in my territory and shook its fist and shouted. And then, you know, and you are concerned. You are, even though you may be right with the Lord, you really don't know how it's going to come out. We would go, and when I first went to Duke, I couldn't have walked from here to the back door without stopping and sitting down and coughing till I gagged. And they would do treatment, and I would come back home. I would go and walk around the track. I was doing this, doing that. Wasn't coughing, wasn't doing any of those things. And we thought, wow, man, this thing must be shrinking. And we would go back and say, Doc, how you doing? Hey, man, I'm doing this, 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 and this. This must be shrinking. Well, let's do a scan and find out. See him in a couple hours. He'd shake his head and say, no, if anything, it's bigger. Go through treatment again. Come back in 3 weeks. What are you doing? Well, I'm doing more. I'm doing better. I'm doing great. I'm sleeping. I'm doing this. I'm doing that. I'm doing that. It must be working. Let's take a scan and see. Only to, nope, it's bigger. To going into, we're going to do an open biopsy. And I don't know if I've shared this before. I probably have. Forgive me for repeating. But in that moment, that was a break moment. It was a 45-minute procedure. As I was being prepped for that 45-minute procedure, my nurse left me for a few moments. Everyone else, their nurse was with them, but I was by myself. And I felt in my spirit there was the greatest struggle between the enemy in my soul and God for me. And I said, look, God, I said, you said you would walk with me through this, but this day you're going to have to carry me. Because I don't know what's going on, but I don't know. But that 45-minute procedure turned into about an 8.5, 9-hour ordeal. I lost 12 units of blood. They had took a chunk of this tumor. I still have the scars on the front. And I instantly started hemorrhaging. The doctor thought he had nicked the aorta. So they had to open my chest, and thinking that he had nicked the aorta, they discovered that this tumor had tapped in and had to my blood vessels and had its own blood supply. And they spent 8 hours trying to control the hemorrhaging from just one little cut out of one chunk of this thing being removed. And, through that, they found out what they were dealing with, and the pathology had been wrong the entire time. What 2 needle biopsies had showed that they were dealing with, they weren't dealing with at all. And God used that moment, and after that, I knew that I was going to be okay. Even though the prognosis switched that we're going to shrink this thing that's the size of a grapefruit to the size of a golf ball, that it's inoperable and it's going to end your life. I sat between my dad and my brother on each side, and the doctor said, well, we're looking at options. And I said, well, what you're telling me in a nice way is this is going to end my life. And he said, well, if you want it that way, yeah. We don't know what we can do. And it went from that, and I came home and told Tammy, but even then I had the peace. As I stared at that giant that day, my brother and my dad about lost it. And I said, hey, man, it's going to be all right. Because God had already given me in my spirit, He had already fought and won that battle 2 or 3 weeks prior. And I went home and I had to break the news to my wife. She said, I said, it's going to be all right. I don't know how. I do not know how, but it's going to be okay. It goes from then, they say, okay, we've got a plan. It's 40% removal is going to be total success. Total success. That's it. And then we'll deal with it as it grows. And it went from that to when they actually done the procedure, this thing lifted out. And they said, what was attached yesterday, we have no idea. facing that giant, and even going back and having to go through radiation treatment there. I was able to stay at the carrying house and with 20 others that were there, and we got to share our experience. But I got to witness to those that were trying to fight this giant and walk through this valley alone, that they had a Savior that loved them, a God that cared about them. Some were angry, some were bitter, some were accepting, and some weren't. But it was God preparing those moments and facing those giants. Not anything, again, that I did, but it was for Him preparing and for His glory and for His advancing the kingdom. Only to go through all of that, and you think, the enemy, being called into the ministry of, well, you can't do this and you can't, all the things that I couldn't do. He never once told me the things that I could, but Jesus did. God did. And then to go from that to 20 years later with this heart thing. And there he showed back up again, and he said, you're done. How can Pastor Jimmy use you? You only got 24% working, or whatever, however that number is arrived at. And how you're going to be in a wheelchair. You're going to be sitting in a recliner, and you're going to be lucky to be able to go to the refrigerator for a glass of water, and come back without just this, that, and the other. But there again, I remembered back I said the same thing then. That night, and no one knows this probably except Gladys. That night at 3:30 when I was sick, and I didn't know how or didn't know what exactly was going on. All I knew is I couldn't breathe very well. And I prayed, and it was a strange prayer, because usually I don't, would use this word, but because I always believe in praying life over someone or life. But I said, Jesus, if you don't heal me, I'm going to die. And how I knew, I have no clue. Little did I know, at 3:30 that very morning, Jerry Puckett was out of bed praying for me. We don't know. And a lot of times we think we're alone, and that's where the enemy wants us. He wants us to think we're alone. He wants to think that we're useless, that we have no purpose, that all the preparation that God has poured into us will come to naught, that we'll keep it to ourselves, we'll keep our experiences to ourselves. We won't be able to fulfill the purpose that God has. But God says, wait a minute, I'm stronger than that. You've already walked through this. You've come through this valley. You've come through this. You've stood, and it may have been a sling and 5 rocks and a stick, but you were victorious. I've given you enough. I've given you all that you need to be an overcomer. And that was, and I drew back my mind these 8 months. Every time that something has come up, my mind has went back to 20 years ago, and walking through some of those valleys that, they were different, and it was a different giant in some ways. But I remembered, just as God told me that night when Jerry was praying for me and everything, that God, He said, I got this. You're going to be okay. And that was in my spirit. And there again, I didn't know how. I didn't know what was going on. And then only to learn a few hours later of the things that had already happened. And then to say, this damage has been done, and this, that, and the other. I had one moment there in intensive care when they moved me into intensive care from the heart cath, and I shared this with Pastor Jimmy. There were nine folks in that one little cubicle that I was in, and I thought, this is pretty serious here, because I still had God's peace through, and still do. But I thought, and they gathered around my bed, and they all were holding hands, and they said, we want to pray before we all leave. And I just asked them, I said, well, are you going to pray, or you want me to pray? And they said, well, why don't you pray? And I looked in their faces, and I saw the reflection of the giants of hopelessness and despair and care and wear and tear on their faces and in their eyes. And I knew God had me. I was in good shape. And so I started praying for them. And I told Pastor this. I said, even in that moment, if I had to go through all of that for that moment, if it made a difference in one of those person's lives, if they changed because, hey, there were believers. I know there were probably believers there, probably some on the fringe, and probably some that were far from the fringe in that moment and in that room. But if that witnessed to them, and God prepared everything in that for the last 20 years for that moment, and one of them, I hope all, but if one makes heaven for eternity, it'll be worth it. And I say that without reservation. It'll be worth it. But we go if it changed someone's life. And you may say, but Brian, I've tried. I've tried it all. I've tried, and this giant just still strolls out in the yard and shakes his fist and yells at me. Well, at first, if you don't succeed, try again. David, he picked up 5 smooth stones, and I've wondered why 5. And you could probably check with many commentaries or theologians and get many thoughts. And they'll give you several reasons. Well, he had 4 other brothers, and in case they got mad and strolled out, he'd be ready for them, But he dealt with them later on, we find. And then, there were others that said those stones represent grace, or they may represent the 5 areas of the church, or what. I'm sort of the belief, and I've heard this, that it's more or less like the pink elephant in the room. What if he missed? If he only had one and missed, then all he had was a stick. Maybe it was all 5. It was all he could get in his shepherd's bag. But no, I believe he was prepared. Again, he was prepared, because I'm sure he had slung more than one, and one did do the job. I shouldn't use the word trick, sorry. But one did do what its purpose was intended. But what if, his experience there again, resting on the experience prior, that sometimes it may have taken more than one to kill the lion. It may have taken 2 or 3 to have killed the bear. So sometimes the first time it doesn't always work, or doesn't always take. So sometimes we do have to try again. And you may say, I've tried and I've prayed. I've went up front 500 times. We'll go 501 if that's what it takes. If that's what it takes to destroy and defeat and kill that giant. You say, well, maybe I've fasted. I've went to counseling. I've joined an accountability group. And that giant still shows up all day, every day. You do the same. You show up. You show up. There's reward in showing up. One time, as you know, I've been going through cardio or cardiac rehab. Well, there's a young man of 90 years old, I think maybe 91. He had a heart issue in his 70s. I won't give his name, but the last time that I talked, they counted as sessions every day that you go. He has attended 2,326 sessions. He had a heart ailment in his 70s. He's 91. I'm telling you, I'm going every day. I hope to beat his record. I've told him, I'm coming after you. I'm coming after you. But see, he showed up. He committed and he showed up every day. And he's still here after doctors have said, you know, so you show up. See, I've heard it said this way and even put this way. Falling down is an accident. Staying down is a choice. We can trip, we can fall, we pick ourselves back up, we dust off, and you say, you know what, I learned from that. I'll step over that cord next time. I won't be scuffing my feet. I'll step over that cord. And then you can turn around to your brother or sister behind you and say, hey, watch the cord. It's a killer. You know, I've been there. I know. I've fallen. I had to get up. So watch. That's just giving encouragement to one another, because why? We faced that giant and we picked ourselves up and we dusted ourselves on and we kept on keeping on. Lastly, I'll close with this and in our preparation of purpose. Stop letting your giant do all the talking. Cancer, it done a lot of talking. And had to go through it. My heart condition, it done a lot of talking. But and it would say, what good are you now? What good are you now? Yeah, you've served God, you've served the Lord, you've went into the ministry, you've done all this. What good did that do you? You still had a heart attack. Wasted time, wasted life, wasted this. You could have been doing this. You could have been doing all this. Just like Goliath strolling out and shouting and waving his fist and all the grandeur and everything. Loud does not equate to strong nor right. What slew Goliath? I am going to read that. It's found in 45. It says, David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me. I will strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. What slew Goliath? David's faith, David's preparation, God being with him in the wilderness watching sheep. The God in David was stronger than the giant. He told him this day. A lot of times that's what we need to tell when those giants are shouting. Loud does not equate strong nor right. That the God inside of me is greater than you, that is standing there telling me that I can't, or I won't, or I'm not going to make it, or that this loved one won't be saved, or that I'm not going to make a difference, because each and every one of you, whether you know it or not, has already made a difference in my life. So you can chalk that one up. And you can tell the giant, I have made a difference, because you have and you do. Because he told him that the giant that stood in front of him, he said, this day, all of that for this day. All of that in the wilderness for this day. All of that preparation, all of that fighting the many lions, the bears that he had faced, all the but you're just a boy. Even Saul said, you're just a boy. Goliath said, you're just a boy. All of that for that day, for that moment, for this time. The time of purpose has come, guys, in all of us. We just got to look for it. And if we're facing giants, if we're facing even frustrations, we take command of it because we say, the God that's in me is greater than you that is in the world. Amen?